I have gotten this question so many times. Does the Bible really ask us to save sex for marriage? And you guys know our story that we decided to save sex for marriage, but you also know me. I want to know every side of an issue. I remember as a teenager being like, where's the verse that says premarital sex is wrong? And people were like, well, anytime it talks about sexual immorality, that means any sex outside of marriage. And I'm like, okay, but is that really what it meant when it was written? I'm a person who likes to ask questions. I want to know all the different sides of the story. I want to know the different arguments. I want to know, is what I believe, does this make sense, or are there other ways to approach the Bible on this issue? So in today's video, I asked James to help me because I was nervous about filming it. We're going to do three things. The first is we're going to give you a skeleton outline of some different arguments for and against premarital sex biblically. The second thing we're going to do is talk about the questions you should be asking as you're making this decision. And the third thing is I'm going to share the reasons I'm thankful we waited that actually have nothing to do with the Bible. And at the very end, we're going to share a little bit personally about where we stand on this issue and what we would do if we had to do it over. So the three perspectives that we've seen about premarital sex are as follows. And I have some articles linked down below if you want to dive deeper into these. So do you want to present the argument for the traditional approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think the traditional approach, which I will say I personally hold, is when you look at what the Bible says about having sex, go to the 10 Commandments, don't commit adultery. You're honoring the marriage covenant. And the way that I think about that is, what is the underlying logic? The underlying logic is that sex is really important to marriage, and it's not really something to be done with anyone. And I think just my view of sexuality kind of bears that out. I would say in most conservative churches, this is what is sort of taught, and it's sort of taught as like, this is the way it is.
And I think for a lot of Christians, anytime they see the word sexual immorality in the scripture, they relate that to any sex outside of marriage. The verse that to me seems the clearest for this argument is in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says, if you burn with lust, get married. That's what Paul writes that. And to me, like that's the verse for me that's like, oh, a real strong argument for saving sex for marriage. Now that being said, in that day, they didn't have boyfriends and girlfriends. They weren't dating. They were just betrothed. You were like not married or you were married. So it was a different culture. But to me, that's the biggest argument.
But any view can be spiritually manipulated. Like if someone is young and thinks, oh my goodness, I just really want to have sex and so I should get married prematurely.
Right. That's not healthy. Yeah. The second view you might see with Christians is the monogamous view, where it's not so much about saving sex until your wedding. It's more about having sex in a committed relationship to one person. And so for a lot of the arguments for this come back to the Bible being written to a very different culture, where you see in the Old Testament especially, a lot of the punishments for sex outside of marriage had to do with a woman being seen as property. And so the punishments were more about repaying her father or her whoever for taking their property. You also see, kings having tons of different wives. Even in the New Testament, Paul's like, if you want to be an elder in the church, you got to be a husband of only one wife now. So you see a very different approach to sex and marriage in the Bible because of the culture in which it was written. Some people would also say, arguing for the monogamous view, that the Song of Songs is an argument for that, of two people who some would say were not actually married, but were
at that
betrothed,
point in time, yeah.
And they were still having sex and delighting in it. So again, the traditional view would say, no, they were already married, but
or that it was just they were imagining.
Right.
Perhaps.
But the monogamous view would say they were having sex, they weren't yet married, and the Bible is celebrating that. So that's, I would say, the monogamous view.
Yeah, that's a good overview.
And I know somebody close to me who adheres to this, and she really took her time thinking about it. She wasn't just like, let me have sex with my boyfriend, let's get on this. Instead, she's like, I want to figure out, what do I think the Bible's intent is here? And she ended up landing on this view. And even though it's not the view I hold, I respect that. And I think that made a lot of sense for her.
It's funny. I grew up in a very sort of conservative tradition. And certainly at one point in my life, I would have thought, you can say that someone could biblically have sex outside of marriage. That is wrong. You are out. And, I still think that is kind of the biblical view. But I have grown to appreciate, this is not something that's on the same level of importance as believing that Jesus is fully God and fully man, and that Jesus is the only way to have a relationship with God. You know, it's important to look for the truth, but you also have to always keep in mind what are the most important, what is the core of knowing and serving Jesus. And I would say the last view that I have heard of is that, you know, a lot of the prohibitions against sex that we read about, a lot of it is in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, a lot of it is referring to ritual prostitution. It's really speaking against prostitution, which is, even today, a form of exploitation, and it's really speaking against using sex as exploitation. So, as long as you're not engaging in exploitive sex, your body, your choice.
Yeah. I would say those are the three main views that we
Yes.
know of. And again, if you want to dive more into the Bible verses, the logic behind it, I have articles linked in the description that you can really dive into it with. But that's the skeleton overview. Now let's move on to section number 2 of our video. Here is the process of deciding what you believe on these issues. And there's 3 questions that you should be asking as you're trying to figure this out for yourself.
I think the first one is, why do I want to say yes to sex right now? It's sort of thinking about understanding your own motivation. And, you know, if you're in a discussion with a partner about this, your partner's motivation as well. I think you want to be, for your own benefit, just really honest with one another.
Yeah, and asking, what do I want to gain from this? So for me, like, I remember in my first relationship, I felt like I was constantly being pushed physically, and eventually I reached this point where I'm like, I just need to be sexy enough. If I'm going to keep his attention, I got to be sexy enough. And even though we didn't have sex, I did a whole lot of things that I had never wanted to do with a boyfriend. And it was all about trying to keep his attention. And if that's your reason for having sex, is trying to keep someone's attention, it's never going to work.
You know, that is not healthy. And everyone would agree, that's not a healthy use of sex.
Right.
It's being used to manipulate and on some level used to try to invigorate a relationship that might not be too healthy.
Right. The second question is, what do people that I trust think about this topic in general and for me in particular, in my particular situation? And just kind of listen. That doesn't mean you'll agree with everybody around you, but find some people who you trust, especially if you are somebody like us who's like, I want to honor God. I want to honor the Bible's intent. And find people who live that out in your life and talk with them about this and just hear their perspectives. You don't want to make this decision in a vacuum. You don't want it to just be...
Or even candidly, just you and your partner.
Right.
You should be asking people in your church. And some of them might give you answers that are so cut and dry that you think, that actually was not very helpful. That's why it's so important to get multiple areas of input. And I would say even ask some people who you think might disagree with you, or get some different perspectives.
And the final and most important question is, how can I honor God and love God and others and myself through this decision I'm making? What decision would lead to those outcomes? Because really at the core, you know, Jesus said it's about you love God with all your heart, you love your neighbor as yourself. So what decision would bring that out? I think that's a good baseline to come
And if
back
you're
to.
someone who has a relationship with Christ, then God's Spirit is in your heart. And you can talk to God about this. And you should talk to God about this. This is something that you really want to interact with God about this and say, God, I hold this with an open hand. And I think that process is going to, you know, continue to help you to stay in step with what God's Spirit is doing in your life and in your community.
So now on to the third section of the video, which is the reasons that we are glad we chose saved sex until marriage. When we did this, our primary reason was we want to honor God. We want to honor God and each other. That was kind of it. But the reason I'm thankful for it now actually doesn't have as much to do with that. It has a lot more practical reasons, like the really great things that came from it. So I've got a list here. Number 1, that I could figure out how to enjoy sex, which was a long and hard journey for me, without feeling pressured to fake it until I made it. I didn't have to feel like I had to impress my boyfriend or feel concerned. I was with somebody committed to me for life, and we were going to figure this out together. And that safety was huge for me. Number 2, that our physical intimacy progressed at the same rate as our emotional intimacy and our practical intimacy. Instead of, I think sometimes you can get too far ahead of yourselves physically and it leads to dissonance in your relationship, this false sense of intimacy and closeness that maybe your relationship isn't there yet. And so for us, I felt like everything progressed at the same rate a little more.
Yeah, and I think we were fortunate that we were past our mid-20s. We had sort of like developed more as people.
That is a good point.
And we were also sort of in a place like, we didn't have like, oh gee, well I'm starting medical school, so we probably can't get married for 6 years.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, from dating, and we had known each other as kids, but from
to
dating
6 months.
to married was like 14 months.
Yeah, and you can do that when you're a little older.
Yeah.
If you're 17,
that's not going to work.
That doesn't always work.
So, that also made it easier, more doable for us to save sex for marriage. If we had been dating for 6 years, I don't know.
Yeah, that would have been,
would have been really hard.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we still would have wanted to, but that would have definitely been a very difficult situation. 2 more, and then I'll be done with this section and we'll give a little personal closing. But it allowed us to have a very fun time of dating that was charged with sexual chemistry and hours-long makeout sessions, and we could not get enough of each other.
That's true.
And instead of going from 0 to 60 to just have sex, we had this year of just building and intensity, and that was really cool. I missed that a little bit.
Yeah, that was fun.
And the last thing is, it gifted us a very special first time. We weren't in the heat of a moment in a car or in some random bed. It was we had this beautiful hotel room and a 2 weeks vacation in the Caribbean. It was a very special and holy first moment.
Yeah, because honestly, with the way I was raised, if we had had sex before marriage, I would have felt really guilty. It definitely helped my view of sex, I think, be much healthier.
Waiting, you mean?
Yeah, my view of sex and my view of myself. The flip side could be, I could maybe at some point in my life be very prideful that I did this and be like, at the end of the day, I'm kind of a better Christian than some of you other people. So, I hope that's
Gotta find
how
some
I
balance.
am. Yes.
And I think that brings us perfectly to a personal conclusion. And I think the big thing is, I don't want shame around sex.
We need to help anyone not to have shame resulting from their sexual past or their sexual decisions, because God does not shame people.
And I don't want people feeling so much shame and they are worth less because they're not a virgin or they are less desirable.
Yeah, that's not true. I would say the forces of darkness and the devil at work when you have shame and you're saying, oh my goodness.
I want more openness to discussion of different perspectives, especially things like this. I don't want this idea that there's only one way to understand the Bible and you are a terrible Christian on the outs with God if you don't understand it the way I do. So I guess we still tend toward the traditional view of sex.
Yeah.
If I were to do it again, I would choose that way again.
I would, yeah.
But I also want this to be an open conversation, and I hope this can be helpful. Check out the links below and please comment down below. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, or is there anything you would add to the process of trying to discern, the truth in your life?
Yeah. Love you guys, and we'll see you next week. Bye.